And our mics are working. Oh, nice.
For them to show. Okay. Excellencies, distinguished experts, and participants, I hereby declare open the first public meeting of the 12th session of the group of independent eminent experts on the implementation of Durban Declaration and Program of Action. Excellencies, distinguished participants, I am Dr. Salome Bugwa, living in Ireland, and I'm honored to be elected as the new chairperson of the group of independent eminent experts. I come from Ireland, as I've said. I also serve as one of the Irish Human Rights Commissioners, and I'm the CEO of Akidwa, the network of migrant women living in Ireland. I would like to inform you that yesterday the group had its first private meeting, during which I was elected as the chairperson, following up from my predecessor, Joel Mondoli. We adopted agenda and the program of work. We discussed organizational and procedure matters, and we met privately with some of the stakeholders. During this session, we'll have 4 public thematic discussions. The first one will be on political parties and actors, secularization, far-right growth, and the rise of racism and xenophobia. Second, will be commemorating the 25th years of DDPA, strengthening implementation and closing the gap, which will take place this afternoon. The third one for this session will be addressing racism in digital spaces and advancing education to safeguard youth. And the final one, which is the 4th session, will be on AI and data collection tools, new opportunities for strengthening DPPA monitoring and follow-up. We will also have several private consultations with regional groups of states and civil societies. I will now open the floor for representatives of states and NGOs who wish to make general statement before we start. Representative of civil society, when you take the floor, please state which organization you are presenting. I see no group want to take the place, so I'll go straight to our first discussion this morning. We'll now begin the thematic discussion titled Political Parties and Actors, Secularization, far-right growth, and the rise of racism and xenophobia, which will be facilitated by my distinguished colleague, Professor Joel Modili. Professor Joel is the Professor of Law at the University of Pretoria. He served as the chair last year. Professor Joel, I welcome you to facilitate the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. It is a pleasure to introduce the theme of today's discussion. And as already mentioned, this first thematic discussion of the 12th session of the group of independent eminent experts on the implementation of the DDPA focuses on the confluence of political parties and actors, securitization, and the growth of far-right extremist movements, as well as the rise of racism and xenophobia in global perspective. I'm pleased to have the occasion to share some introductory remarks on this topic that will frame our discussion this morning, whereafter I will then invite our expert speakers to share their perspectives. Excellencies, distinguished delegates and colleagues, we gather at a time when the global political landscape is undergoing what many scholars have pointed out as a profound and deeply troubling transformation or intensification. Across multiple regions in the world, far-right extremism and exclusionary political movements are no longer a marginal phenomena. They're increasingly normalized, institutionalized, and woven into the fabric of political governance, remaking the very meaning of democratic life. This is not simply a matter of shifting preferences in elections or the addressing of legitimate grievances. It signals a deeper reconfigurations of political values, social hierarchies, and as already pointed out, the meaning of democracy itself. These forces that are reshaping the global political order are neither new nor accidental. They're deeply sedimented in the historical and structural logics of exclusion that have defined the history of colonial, racial, and other forms of social oppression. The contemporary rise of far-right extremism and right-wing political formations must therefore be understood not as an aberration from democratic norms, but as an intensification of tendencies that have long coexisted with them. We are witnessing the reassertion of the naturalness of hierarchies, an insistence on exclusion of those deemed as outsiders, and a reanimation of racial, cultural, and religious boundaries of difference that seek to continuously determine and define who belongs and who does not. At the core of the resurgence of right-wing extremism is a set of identifiable features. Far-right extremism tends to be characterized by an exclusionary concept of national, racial, religious, or cultural identity, one that imagines the in-group as pure, as historically fixed, and most importantly, under some kind of existential threat. This imagined threat or crisis is almost always attributed to a group that is marked as a racial, ethnic, or religious other. These others include migrants, refugees, people of African descent, and as we discussed in our 11th session, people of Asian descent, ethnic minorities of various origins, and religious groups who are portrayed as incompatible with the dominant identity or even threatening to it. This is to say that far-right extremism treats the nation or the group or the culture or religion as closed and homogeneous, threatened by the presence of those deemed foreign, different, or incompatible. This construction relies on a politics of fear, in which crisis is not simply identified, but manufactured. Economic insecurity, social change, globalization, political instability are narrated seamlessly, or in simplistic terms, as consequences of migration, of diversity, difference, inclusion, and equity are seen as threats rather than as empowering policies for addressing democratic challenges. In this way, complex structural conditions, some of which we hope our experts will advise us on, are reduced to simplified and heavily racialized explanations. I have already mentioned that this framing of important questions around economic inequality and instability, demographic shifts within particular societies, as well as different kinds of geopolitical uncertainty, come to be framed as emergencies that are caused by specific outsider populations. These narratives are often accompanied by the strategic and politically orchestrated use of fear, the repetition of misinformation, and they produce a climate in which extraordinary measures appear not only justified but necessary. This is to say that the rise of far-right extremism is deeply linked with racism and other forms of cultural exclusion and xenophobia, but also a defining feature of this rise of right-wing extremism is, of course, the turn toward authoritarianism. This is not always expressed through traditionally overt dictatorships of the previous century, but through the gradual manipulation and erosion of democratic processes, norms, and institutions. Independent institutions tend to be weakened. Dissent is delegitimized, and power is concentrated usually in executive powers or in outside economic powers in that society. Elections may continue in these authoritarian systems, but their substance is hollowed out as the rights of minorities and other excluded groups are undermined and oppositional voices are differentially constrained. I've combined here a connection, which is the focus of today's discussion, between the growth of the far right, the erosion of democracy and rise of authoritarianism, its connection then to what we might call the process of securitization, which has remained a continuous theme of this group. Central to the process of far-right growth is usually processes of securitization. Migration, religious diversity, and even social differences are reframed as security threats, threats to the nation, threats to the border. Through this framing, entire populations are constructed as risks or dangers to the survival of the nation. This allows states to expand surveillance, to militarize borders, to launch an influx of policing, often linked to racial profiling in these communities, and to implement different kinds of restrictive laws that would otherwise be unacceptable within democratic and egalitarian frameworks. Securitization, as we know, does not merely respond to perceived threats, it produces them. It produces the narrative about those threats. By repeatedly associating certain groups with danger, criminality, or extremism, securitization tends to entrench racist and xenophobic representations and stereotypes. Migrants are depicted as invaders, religious minorities as extremists or threats to the identity of the nation, and racialized communities are depicted as inherently suspect or criminal. These representations circulate through political discourse, through corporate-owned media narratives, and sometimes through policy and legislative frameworks responding to agitated electorates. This reinforces this cycle of racism, securitization, and authoritarianism. The link between far-right extremism and racism is therefore both ideological and structural. Racism, racial discrimination, and racial othering provides the foundation upon which these exclusions are built. It operates through dehumanization, stereotyping, and the construction of hierarchies that assign differential value to human lives, marking out those who belong and those who do not, those who are a danger and those who deserve to be protected. In contemporary context, these dynamics are often coded in the language of culture, security, and even legality. But their effects remain profoundly racialized and are generating extreme instability both within countries and between them. Xenophobia intensifies these patterns by targeting those perceived as foreign or external. It is a response to the rise of globalization or cosmopolitanism. It's an insistence again that the nation must be one. It manifests in discriminatory policies, social exclusion, and most concerningly, acts of violence. Across regions, there have been documented instances of mob attacks on migrant communities, arson attacks on refugee shelters, targeted killings of individuals based on perceived different ethnicity, religion, or race. Public spaces have become sites of harassment, and entire communities are subjected to suspicion and hostility, making daily life impossible for these groups. It is noted that racial discrimination in many parts of the world is often intertwined as well with religious intolerance. Certain religious identities are racialized, meaning that individuals are targeted not only for their beliefs, but how their beliefs are associated with a stigmatized race culture. This convergence is evident in instances where religious minorities are framed as threats to national values or security, failing to integrate into the dominant culture. The result, therefore, is a form of exclusion that is both racial and religious, often also cultural and ethnic, reinforcing these multiple axes of marginalization and exclusion. Women and children are also disproportionately affected as they experience these dynamics in distinct and intensified ways. Women are frequently subjected to gendered forms of violence, including harassment, exploitation, restrictions on their autonomy, and other kinds of sexualized stereotypes, all justified through this racial national narrative of the inside and the outside. Migrant and refugee women in particular face heightened vulnerability in detention centers, border zones, informal settlements, and the like. Children are profoundly affected by these developments as well. They experience disruption in education, exposure to violence, and long-term psychological harm that, of course, also impacts on the national development of those societies. In some contexts, children from these marginalized communities are subjected to surveillance, policing, institutional discrimination, kicked out of schools, or denied certain kinds of public amenities. These conditions create fertile ground for narratives that attribute hardship to migrants or minorities, rather than to understand the history of structural economic inequality as the center of a shared global challenge. Demographic change plays a significant role in this regard. In regions that experience increasing diversity, populations perceive a loss of cultural dominance or a loss of historical, economic, or social power, loss of privileged access to particular opportunities. These perceptions are often amplified by political rhetoric that frames diversity as dilution or as replacement. The in-group perceives itself as in danger, needing to protect itself, and usually animated by a powerful or influential populist leader. Such narratives are not new, Madam Chair. They echo older ideologies rooted in white supremacy and other forms of exclusion. They posit the idea that the social order depends on the preservation of racial hierarchies, an idea that our work and the DDPA is committed to continuously challenging and eradicating. Racial supremacy, whether explicit or implicit, remains a powerful undercurrent in contemporary far-right movements. It expresses itself in the belief that certain racial or cultural groups are inherently superior, entitled to dominance, or at risk of some form of contamination or invasion. While often framed in different kinds of language, the core assumption that persists in the policies and discourses is that some group is deserving of inclusion and others should be excluded, that some groups belong the ladder of the hierarchy and some beneath it or below it, and therefore that certain groups need to be controlled, regulated, surveilled, or excluded, removed. Historical colonialism is also central to these developments. Colonial systems, as we know, were built upon racial, cultural, gendered, and other hierarchies that sought to justify domination, that sought to legitimize through legal, political, and other means the exploitation and dispossession of colonized communities. These were institutionalized not only through law, but also through educational and economic structures, leaving these enduring legacies behind, which now shape not only global inequalities, but global social contradictions. The patterns of migration we see today are themselves deeply connected to colonial histories. Borders, economic dependencies, and conflict dynamics often trace back to colonial and neo-colonial intervention. Yet the movement of people from formerly colonized regions is frequently framed as a threat, rather than as part of a historical process shaped by these global power relations. In colonialism, a narrative of otherness was produced. Colonized populations were depicted as uncivilized, dangerous, or inferior. These representations persist, Madam Chair, in contemporary discourse as racialized and religious minorities are constructed repeatedly and over again as outsiders, regardless of their citizenship rights or their belonging, or even their skills and contribution to the relevant societies. Far-right movements have capitalized upon these narratives, have capitalized upon these social contradictions, reactivating these anxieties, reactivating these resentments. Madam Chair, the consequences of these developments that we will be discussing in this session for democracy, both national democracy and global democracy, are profound and they warrant deep and serious attention. Democracy, in its simplest sense, depends on the recognition of the equal dignity and protection of all people. It requires the balancing of majority and minority rights towards shared goals of equality and peace. Therefore, as you can imagine, when entire groups are excluded, dehumanized, or marked for securitization, these fundamental core principles and values of democracy are radically undermined. The result is a form of governance that formally retains democratic procedures, but in fact erodes the very substance of democracy. The implications extend beyond national borders. These problems are both national and transnational. Since xenophobia and exclusionary forms of nationalism and nativism weaken international cooperation and peace, they make it more difficult to address shared challenges such as climate change, migration, and global inequality, and have even imperiled organizations such as ours, the United Nations. They also increase the risk of conflict. Another theme of our focus in previous sessions, armed conflict, by fostering distrust and antagonism between communities and between states. International human rights mechanisms have repeatedly warned of these trends. Reports have repeatedly highlighted the normalization of hate speech, the rise in racially and religiously motivated violence, and the role of new forms of populist political leadership in shaping the public discourse. These reports have emphasized that racism and xenophobia are not only social or interpersonal problems, but issues that are embedded in institutions and policies. These reports, developed by special rapporteurs and other international human rights agencies, draw attention to the ways in which securitization, racism, xenophobia, authoritarianism are all deeply connected and need to be attended to. Indeed, counterterrorism measures, border controls, policing practices often disproportionately target specific communities. This, of course, violates human rights, but also reinforces social, public, and institutional perceptions that these communities are inherently dangerous. The United Nations call to move from rhetoric to reality in realizing the end of racism or realizing a world free of racism underscores the urgency of translating the commitments spelled out in the DDPA and other instruments of human rights and anti-racism into action. It is no longer sufficient to condemn racism and xenophobia, since this is being openly promoted by states, governments, political leaders, and influential actors within those societies. States must actively dismantle the structures, social, economic, political, and legal, that sustain these conditions. This requires a thinking for or of comprehensive strategies that address the legal, economic, social, and discursive dimensions of racism, xenophobia, and the rise of far-right extremism. Legal frameworks, as a start, must be strengthened where they are lacking to combat discrimination and hate crimes, while ensuring accountability for violations. At the same time, national human rights policies must address structural inequalities by promoting equitable access to resources, education, opportunities, repairing and redressing historical damage caused, among others, by colonialism and other forms of extraction. Without such firm measures, efforts to counter intolerance will remain limited or perhaps even abortive. Education and the reshaping of public discourse with democratic and progressive norms is equally critical. Challenging stereotypes, promoting historical awareness, and fostering inclusive narratives through difficult conversations about the historical past and present are essential for building democratically resilient societies. Media and digital platforms must also be engaged to counter the misinformation and to prevent the amplification of extremist content. There must be a sustained commitment to transnational and international solidarity, human rights, democracy, justice, reparations must be non-negotiable. As I've already mentioned, Madam Chair, the challenges that we face in this regard are transnational, so too must the response. Cooperation, accountability, and shared responsibility are essential for addressing the root causes of racism, xenophobia, and authoritarianism, and for rebuilding broken, divided, and damaged societies. The rise of far-right extremism is not an inevitable development. It is the result of a long historical series of choices, policies, narratives, and conditions that can be challenged and transformed. Doing so requires, as we have already pointed out in previous reports, requires political will, but it also requires a general social and institutional willingness to confront the deeper structures of inequality and exclusion that sustain this movement. It requires a no-tolerance approach to racism and any other forms of cultural supremacy. The task before us, we know, is urgent and it is complex. We must move, again, from rhetoric to reality, beyond symbolic commitments, and start charting a course of meaningful action. We must recognize the interconnectedness of racism and xenophobia, religious intolerance, authoritarianism, securitization, and find strategies to address these in a holistic manner. In doing so, we affirm the principles that underpin the DDPA, its commitment to a world free of racism, one governed by shared norms of human rights, dignity, and democratic governance. We affirm that dignity is universal, that diversity is a reality and a strength, and that security will never be achieved through exclusion and fear. This is the work of moving from rhetoric to reality. It is the work of building a world in which justice, equality, and human dignity are not merely aspirational ideals or promises on paper, but lived realities for all. We will now begin, Madam Chair, the thematic discussion on this topic, and I will invite our expert speakers to share some perspectives with us and give us a sense of the trends and problems and features of the growth of far-right extremism, what kinds of actors are involved in those processes, and what can be done to combat these troubling developments as we have indicated them. We hope that these discussions will assist us in charting a way using the DDPA as our core framework in addressing this question. Thank you, Madam Chair. I will now introduce the speakers. I will start with introducing Dr. Christina Shori Liang, who is head of the Counterterrorism and Preventing Violent Extremism at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. At GCSP, Dr. Liang delivers courses on preventing violent extremism and transnational organized crime. Dr. Liang leads the GCSP's monthly Geneva security debates, which feature the world's leading thinkers on important security challenges. Dr. Liang is a prolific writer who's given over 100 academic and policy-related presentations in over 35 countries. She has recently contributed to a chapter on decoding the new geopolitics of cyberspace, hybrid operations, and emerging technologies and their impact on states and societies in a book entitled Negotiating Identity Conflicts in a Fragmenting World Order. She's also currently the editor of a NATO book that will be published at the end of the year entitled Terrorism in 2040, How to Counter Asymmetric Warfare in a Hyper-Connected World. She has been teaching courses at the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po in Paris since 2017. She holds a doctorate in international relations from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies here in Geneva, Switzerland. And I have the pleasure of inviting Dr. Liang to take the floor. Dr. Liang, the floor is yours.
You have set the stage so eloquently and really introduced the topic so well that I have little to say after this wonderful introduction. But I still would like to focus a little bit on the way the right-wing extremism as we see it today, and how it will evolve, and also what we can already do against it. So one of the things I've always noticed is that a lot of presentations are usually 90% the problem and 10% the solution. So I've tried to actually do exactly half by presenting the problem and then half presenting some solutions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about far-right growth. and then we'll focus on the rise of youth radicalization risks and some ideas for best responses. So I always show my students in Paris this picture. It sort of, for me, describes where we are. It is the headline story of every news channel, and it's really what's driving the focus away from hatred and right-wing extremism to another big problem, and that's who will win the world, geopolitics. And so I would say there are many different trends that are happening in the world today, and these are the 4 megatrends that I've highlighted that are making violent non-state actors grow, more powerful. And one is this entire resurgent geopolitical competition. It is keeping us away from looking at the threat of right-wing extremism and violence. And another thing that is really growing is the weakness of states. We see more and more fragility in states all over the world. Even the strongest democracies in the world are failing. And we see, of course, conflict and war, and this has a huge impact on violent non-state actors and their growth. Another thing that is, of course, incredibly relevant is climate change. The climate emergency is making weakening states as well. And then, of course, technology, AI, the tech titans who are going to have more and more of an impact on how we see the world and who will rule the world. So the eye sort of on global right-wing extremism started very dramatically in 2011. You see in just 6 short years, there were 350 white extremist terrorist attacks. And this was a really kind of a wake-up call. But then, of course, there was another threat multiplier. And you can see the right-wing extremist attacks are mostly happening in North America, in Europe, and in Oceania. But I believe that the COVID-19 had really created what the Munich Security Conference called a polypandemic. We saw it as a huge global health pandemic. It created more inequalities, those who actually were inoculated and those who couldn't get access to vaccines. We saw an enormous poverty pandemic, violence pandemic, education pandemic. A lot of kids weren't in school for 2 years. But the 3 ones that really highlight, I think, what we were talking about today is COVID-19 unleashed an extremism pandemic, also an disinformation pandemic, and now we see more and more an authoritarian pandemic, where we see more and more democracies weakening and authoritarian type style governments becoming more powerful. We had a happy moment, though, with Hungary just recently, so it's not all going badly. So why is extremism growing? We see that there's extremists are spreading because of new technologies. These are being spread by politicians, by influencers, also politicians have become more and more legitimizers of extremism. And we see more and more action on this regard. One of the biggest groups that is hurting the most from this is Generation Z. They really see this as a polycrisis. Climate change, war, economic worries, worries about jobs. This is leading to extremist temptations. And these threats are not abstract, they are felt, they are immediate, they are felt as existential dangers. And this has created a profound psychological demand for urgency and moral clarity. And this has come as post-COVID-19 due to economic crisis and as we see more and more conflict and war. So how do we protect our youth? I will elaborate that in a couple more slides. Another thing that we see more and more is the globalization has created more job losses. And this has led to right-wing extremists pushing very strongly that immigrants are actually the reason why there are less employment opportunities. And they use these narratives, they push these narratives due to political frustration, and of course technology is acting as amplifiers to this kind of new rhetoric. And we see that in social media, we see that all over. And of course, the extremist groups are also using this technology to spread their ideas, interact with potential allies, organize festivals and demonstrations, and support populist parties. And so this is a very strong movement. We see more and more extremist groups conducting hate crimes. We see more mass shootings. We see bombings and arson attacks, and more and more online radicalization and incitement. Again, the internet and social media has a very dark side, and this has now become more and more significant in online spaces that I will elaborate on in a couple more slides. And one of the things that we see more and more, of course, is the organization of these extremist groups. They're able to organize better because they can find each other online, and they can use the internet space as a place to hide, but also to share their ideas globally. We also see that especially white supremacist terrorist groups are now acting alone, and they're actually the most dangerous. These are the lone wolf attacks, and they're hard to catch because they are they don't set many trails online. I will not elaborate more on the cultural nationalism, ethnic nationalism, and racial nationalism, because I think Dr. Modiri did a brilliant job on that. But we see more and more this populist radical right growth in politics. And these are where people are asking that the ruling elites must be replaced, but they do not want to prevent democracy. However, we see more and more also extreme right-wing groups, and these are the ones who are calling for democracy to be replaced. They're talking about violence against enemies, and they are much more dangerous. And these are the ones who espouse racial nationalism and ethnic nationalism as opposed to cultural nationalism. So extremist groups are becoming more tactically and technically sophisticated. They're drawing attention to themselves online in so many different spaces. They're infiltrating populist parties and protest movements, And they have a huge subculture in the real world, in music, in festivals, music festivals that are just promoting extremist thinking. They're also involved in mixed martial arts competition. They use code words and symbols, and they are now more and more infiltrating the gaming space. So this, and where youth are very young, vulnerable because they're young, they haven't quite, their brains haven't quite developed yet, and they are literally, the extremists are going for the low-hanging fruit. And now these gaming spaces have been weaponized and are using extremist themes in some of the gaming culture. One of the books that was really important and has led to a lot of conspiracy theories, but is this idea of the le grand remplacement, the idea that the current, especially in Europe, ethnic and civilization is in jeopardy because it is the Europeans, and especially also in North America, there's this idea that they will be flooded with non-white immigrants. And this anti-modern, anti-capitalist ideas are now being pushed by right-wing extremists. And you see this developing also into demographic conspiracy theories that are pushed by right-wing extremists and by terrorist groups. One book also very worrisome is called Eurabia, the Arab Euro Axis, and it talks about European and Arab elites have collaborated to ensure the Muslim domination of Europe since the 1970s. So there's some very terrifying books out there, and these books have impact. They have impacted people like Anders Breivik, who also wrote a terrorist manifesto talking about these conspiracy theories. Another one which is really worrisome was the Great Replacement Manifesto, which was the manifesto written by the Christchurch terrorist attacker. And you see more and more, a lot of these terrorist groups have their own manifestos, and they push these demographic conspiracy theories. Another thing that I worry about is hate speech. We see more and more hate speech. Germany's federal Agency for Civic Education describes hate speech as where people are devalued, attacked, or when hatred or violence is called for against them. And hate speech is very dangerous because it can lead to violence and murder. We've seen that in the attacks in Christchurch, in New Zealand, in Palais, where Germany's a German was motivated to do this due to his right-wing extremist views. Also, we see a politician who was killed in his own home by a neo-Nazi extremist because of his pro-refugee beliefs. So these types of extremism are very dangerous. Another thing that I worry about is that we see more and more lies on the internet, disinformation, and lies travel faster, wider, and deeper, according to an MIT study. Lies are 70% more likely to be retweeted than truths. and this is, and they're going much more deeply and more broadly. So we really need more accurate reporting, more balanced reporting in the world. So one of the things that is also worrisome for me is terror attacks. Whenever there's a terror attack, there is a kind of a peak in extremist thinking by even people who are usually moderate. And we see this where there was a peak of attacks, especially between 2015 and 2017. Again, overall terrorism deaths in Western Europe are very low compared to other hotspots in the world. But these attacks have bigger repercussions because they influence young people, they influence politicians, and their rhetoric changes. We just saw recently a stabbing attack of two Jews in the UK, and just these two Jews being stabbed has raised the UK level of terrorism threat to an entire new level. So there are immediate repercussions to these types of attacks. Another fact that worries me is when we see a terrorist attack or a lone wolf attack, there's something called copycat terrorism. And for example, for the Christchurch attack or all these other ones in Poe, in El Paso, in Halle, what these extremist terrorists did was they posted a manifesto, they attacked a target, and then they sometimes even streamed their act live on the internet. And at the same time, they called for imitation. Now, again, this has a very terrorizing appeal for young people all over the world. This is a very scary time. And this leads to extremism. So it's tragic that an extremist act actually amplifies extremism. So there was a brilliant paper on how terrorist attacks shape political agendas by two young women in France. And there's the title, How Terror Attacks Shape Political Agendas on Multiculturalism in France. And what they discovered is that mainstream parties move toward more negative rhetoric on cultural diversity in Islam following terrorist attacks. So this has a kind of a circular feel to it, where an attack creates more extremism and then leads to even more attacks. So it's a very difficult and worrisome development. So terrorist attacks really reshape political competition, and they pull the center more to exclusionary positions. And as we see this in the more and more anti-multicultural rhetoric in French politics, just as an example. So another thing that I wanted to highlight is how mainstream parties adjust their rhetoric. Again, illiberal language has become more acceptable. And this is really highlighting again this paradox that in an attempt to defend liberal values after a crisis, political actors actually adopt rhetoric that weakens those same values. So this, now I'm going to start moving towards the solutions, so don't worry. These are some of the tools of modern extremists and criminals. We see the surface web, the deep web, and the dark web. More and more, we're having trouble to find what is happening in the dark web. It is indeed dark, and this is having a real problem in trying to find solutions. Terrorists and extremists have become online predators. They target and influence and recruit individuals online. Again, they are looking for vulnerable, isolated groups, and they tailor their messages accordingly. They're now using AI to do it even more efficiently. Once they're doing it, they recruit on social media and in gaming platforms. Then they groom these young people and slowly introduce them to extremist ideas. They also share with them videos, memes, and narratives to normalize these ideologies. And they create closed communities that reinforce these beliefs and close others out. And they also use algorithms to amplify contact. They use psychological tactics, the us versus them, again, that were so eloquently highlighted earlier. They're, of course, in an anonymous space, and they have access to young people 24/7. So the digital landscape has become a highly personalized online experience to many youth. And it's where young people go to build community, to express their creativity, and sometimes even now to access psychosocial support. So we see everything that people are doing now online is becoming important, because if you just see how much time a young person spends on their smartphone or in the digital space, and now even more using AI chatbots for emotional support, we see even young people having AI companions and using the internet as specifically for mental health or emotional support. We really, really, really need to focus on protecting this space. And when I talk about this space, I mean online, social media, and the internet. Just as an example, young people are introduced at a very young age already with memes. I caught a young man looking at memes online, and he showed them to me, and he said they're funny, but hatred is never funny. But this is how extremists introduce hatred. They introduce it first as a meme, as something funny, and then they catch them in these nets of extremism. Here you see there are 160 million memes that are being pushed online. They are racist memes, political memes, and they're pushing out into the world. I was so angry about these memes and what they're doing to young people. I wrote a paper on how to prevent right-wing extremists from exploiting the internet. So if you're interested, it's online, you can find it. Emerging, we see a generational gap, because young people are in this digital space, and us older people, parents, educators, and policymakers, we face the challenge of not understanding this online environment, and we don't understand how to set effective safety frameworks. So we need to understand that this is a space that is dangerous, and we need to find ways to prevent young people from being pulled into these spaces. So what can we do? We have to help people online and offline. We have to help them detect harmful online activity. We're now working with internet companies. We're looking at a wide range of harm-related signals, more nuanced and targeted interventions. We're working on countermeasures against harmful contact, and we're trying to find positive intervention strategies. One of the things we see now is AI-driven detection tools are now being used, and predictive behavioral models are being used. Of course, we have to be very careful that these don't in any way abuse our own human rights and privacy laws. But again, it's very difficult and very worrisome, and we need to work closely with tech companies to develop hybrid moderation systems. Youth arrests have become significant. We see that in the UK, in Canada, in Europe, in West Africa, and as well due to Five Eyes intelligence assessments. Growing concern about especially youth becoming radicalized and offending after being radicalized online. Key trigger events that have driven policy has been these live stream attacks that we've seen globally in the US, Germany, Turkey, Russia, India. And there's a very good report on this, on how online platforms have become extremist amplification sites. So what we do now is there's new EU legislation. The EU Parliament and Council have reached a political agreement, and they've now used automated filters to detect terrorist content online. And the regulation entered into force on June 2022. We now need to protect our citizens. We need to protect cognitive spaces. We have to make sure that our citizens and our young people are protected against this kind of threat. We also need to widen, we have to help this digital fluency gap. We have to understand better what educators and policymakers still don't have platform literacy. They don't understand online ecosystems. So we really need to understand this to create and demand youth online safety frameworks and digital resilience strategies. And we have to create more counter-extremism programming. We need an offense strategy, and we need to be more reactive and more defensive and more proactive. So we have to build awareness, whole of government and whole of society approach. And there's many organizations now that are working on this. And we have to strengthen the ability for governments to work in this space. We need better examples of interventions on how to do it. We have YouTube counter playlists use the redirect method campaigns. TikTok and Instagram influencer-based counter-extremism campaigns are already happening in Europe. So there's now more kind of native delivery, meaning that intervention works best sometimes inside the platforms where the exposure occurs. So in gaming environments, in social media, in YouTube and TikTok. So we have new laws. The EU is very comprehensive and rights-based. They have the Digital Services Act, the General Data Protection Regulation, and Audiovisual Media Services Directive. We see here, you will get my slides, but again, you can see there's a lot of new legislation, coordination, and capacity building. The EU model is generally seen as a global benchmark. It combines privacy, safety, and platform accountability. But newer laws like the one in Australia now is pushing for much stricter control, and the global trend is moving in that direction. The EU's regulation and dissemination of terrorist content online was applied in June 22. This means now that internet companies in the EU now have to take swift measures to prevent the misuse of their services, or they can face potential financial losses. The UK has a very strict platform responsibility, the Online Safety Act. They impose a legal duty of care on tech companies, and they require that platforms prevent exposure to harmful content. Australia is the most aggressive and restrictive, as I just highlighted. It's the first ban on social media for under 16s. The US is more privacy focused but fragmented. They're much more looking at parental consent, and they have a key law, Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. Singapore has a state-led regulation and community prevention that leads to counter-extremism policy, and they look at religious rehabilitation group that helps Islamic scholars provide counter-ideology counseling. They're very good at building harmony and interracial and religious confidence circles. They're very good at state-led regulation and community. Germany has a very strong network as well, the Network Enforcement Act on civil society prevention. And here are some of the you can see on my slides, some of the work they do. What we need is to have more fast removal and terror content laws. The EU terrorist content online regulation calls for removal within 1 hour of identification. Governments also need to invest in preventing and countering violent extremism programs. We see more and more that there's less work being done on that, and there should be actually more. And these platforms should focus on counter narratives and digital literacy. Finland is probably the poster child country in the world that does the best work on prevention and education. They take a research-based approach, but a whole of society and whole of government approach. And here are some of their organizations: the Radia Knowledge Center, the Finnish National Agency for Education, and Save the Children Finland. So it's our policy response must be to protect our citizens, their cognitive biases, and to understand algorithms and give them a stronger belief system and a better moral compass. So how do we define security in 2026? We no longer just need to think of safety of the state, organization, or individual from danger. We need to think of the state as also having to protect the psychological and informational space, the cognitive space for young people, because they're more and more becoming exposed to these extremist ideas. So digital literacy, teaching online safety, and modules for educators. We at the GCSP do these types of work. So thank you so much for your attention. Final takeaways. A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. I thought this is an appropriate quote from Mark Twain. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lang, for that expansive and instructive presentation, highlighting, of course, the challenges that in particular young people face in an advanced digital world that exposes them to this kind of harmful content, opening them up to extremist pathways and endangering the fabric of those societies and their democratic future. So that was a wonderful presentation. We thank you very much for that. And I'm sure there will be many questions for you in order to get to the deeper roots of what you offer. I must also thank you for some of the helpful guidance that you've provided in relation to what the best practice might be in terms of addressing the rise of far-right extremism, especially in the digital space, where it is being amplified and finding fertile ground. So thank you very much for that very wonderful presentation. Let me now introduce our second speaker, Madam Chair, Mr. Luis Fernandez, who is the founder and executive director of Práctica Internacional de Derechos Humanos. In English?
International Practice of Human Rights.
The International Practice of Human Rights, an organization that brings the voices and struggles of local human rights defenders from Latin America and Europe to the heart of the United Nations here in Geneva. His work is focused on translating complex diplomatic language into effective tools for the protection of human dignity. He's also the founder of Práctica Laboratoria para la Democracia, a Latin American organization devoted to fostering civic participation and building leadership capacities within social movements. Mr. Fernandez has supported strategies to combat inequality and discrimination, including advocacy for ILO Convention 89 and efforts to advance the recognition of social security rights for domestic workers in Mexico. For more than 20 years, he has been dedicated to understanding and improving the relationship between citizens and government, from academia, working on citizen participation and governance, from government designing and implementing participatory public policies, from a political party, coordinating and advancing agendas within civil society organizations, collectives, movements, and organized groups. And from civil society, he's been focused on community organizing and advocacy coalitions. He holds several degrees in political science and international relations, as well as a master's degree in public administration and public policy. It's a great pleasure to have you here, Mr. Fernandez, and I hand the floor over to you. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas. Thank you
very much for the introduction, and thank you also to Christina for having shared those fantastic ideas. I just want to kick off with a couple of ideas on the basis of Christina's presentation. The first is these trends that we see among the various extremist right groups, is how they organize themselves. Political parties are spaces where you get connections between various interests, and on the basis of the connection between those interests, they then contest political power and decision making. And I think that's one of the ideas I want to delve into in this presentation. The second concept, which I think is essential, which is shown in the first minutes, I think, of this process, is that there are various social movements around the world organizing themselves right now, organizing ourselves to hold back the advance of the extreme right. And one thing that springs to mind is that last week there were various organizations who presented around the world an anti-authoritarian kit. If you look for that on the net, it's out there. And I think this reflects one of the key efforts that's been made to address the concerns we're seeing on a daily basis in terms of the ownership of this space. And I'll refer back to that throughout this presentation. The idea really here is that I'd like to share a general argument, and under that 5 very specific ideas and 6 operative recommendations for the group to bear in mind. The idea itself is very simple, and it's that the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action doesn't need to be rewritten or reinterpreted. It needs to be communicated, and above all, it needs to be enforced. This is a complex idea. Political parties around the world don't necessarily know this declaration. They don't necessarily root their decision making in it. And when in 2001 it was signed, the states of the world recognized that political parties can have a double role. They can be a vehicle of inclusion. And if you look at paragraph 104 of the preamble, they can be a factor which also fosters racism if they do not comply with their obligation to denounce it. And this double role is important to bear in mind. We must understand these political parties as a space to connect these vested interests. And now, 25 years after signing this declaration, there is an international extreme right current, which is conflating the fact that racism and xenophobia is not on the periphery anymore. It lies at the heart of these debates. It is in fact the rallying cry with which people are attaining power. And this agenda has electoral pedigree now. And at the same time, we're seeing this polarization, as Christina said, in the various networks. It gathers steam when that is based on emotions which obviously can move various social groups around the world. Now, the question here is not whether or not the declaration applies this, as paragraph 105 says, but with which tools you can actually ensure compliance, and in which context can those be used to combat the principal detractors. Now, I'm going to look at political parties here as a double-edged sword. In 2001, the declaration did anticipate this double role, and paragraph 83 establishes that we underline the key role that political leaders and political parties can play and ought to play in combating racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. That's a direct quote. So we're not talking about freedom of parties here. If you read this in conjunction with paragraph 74 of the preamble, we're talking about an obligation to denounce and promote equality. The political mission isn't neutral. At the end of the day, to do otherwise is an offence, and in many countries it is an offence to do otherwise. But the declaration goes further in paragraph 85, and here in our judgment, this is one of the most underused tools to combat racism around the world. It states, we condemn political platforms and organizations based on racism, xenophobia, or doctrines of racial superiority and related discrimination as incompatible with democracy and transparent and accountable governance. And here we have some examples around the world who now promote openly this. We have examples, Alternativa in Germany, Vox in Spain. We have other sectors, Christina mentioned them, Republican sectors in the Republican Party who promote the extreme right within the Republican Party in the United States. One of apparently, allegedly, the most consolidated democracies of the world, which is also confronting crisis. Now, this is incompatible with democracy, in fact. And the innovative factor in 2026 isn't the existence of these parties, but the industrial scale on which they are growing. We're not talking about marginalized parties, we're talking about political forces which are in government or in majority governments in El Salvador, in the United States, in Argentina, in Italy, in Hungary, in the Netherlands. And they are approaching and contesting elections by presenting these manifestos openly. Now, I want to ask the group not to lose sight of appropriate response to this. The fact is that the tyranny of the majority must not prevail. Democratic legitimacy requires that winning an election doesn't substitute the democratic principle of the exercise. When a platform crosses a threshold of racism, xenophobia, doctrines of superiority or structural racism, they cease to be democratic in the genuine sense of the word. These are anti-democratic values. And this is a decisive fact for responding to the populist argument that a government, when it wins an election, has a green light to do what it wants. And I think this needs to be contested. So I won a majority and therefore my program is democratic. I won an election and therefore I can capture democratic institutions. I can have a manifesto that is xenophobic and anti-migration. I could go on with many examples, but that's false logic. So for 25 years, the Durban Declaration has been giving us the legal answer, which is the key to this: human dignity, and communities that are historically discriminated against must lean on this. And that is that the tyranny of the majority cannot prevail. Political parties are responsible, as paragraph 108 recognizes, responsible for fostering inclusion. They must have an equitable representative of victims' communities in parliaments, judiciary, the police, the army, or on the other hand, they can become, citing paragraph 85, in an entity which is incompatible with democracy. And the declaration calls on us to opt for the first option and gives us tools to sanction the choice to go for the second option. And this brings me to the second idea. I'm not sure if I've got the right slide here. Yeah. So entities which require political and legal control in the face of the capture by political parties with an extreme right agenda is something that is addressed by the Durban Declaration. The paragraph states that this must be a punishable offence, this capturing. You can't interact with political communities and encourage acts which constitute an offence. So if a political party encourages hate speech, the priority must be that that is punishable legally. And at the end of the day, when they promote the implementation of offences under the law, that has to be taken seriously. So that's in the terms of the 5th article of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Now, paragraph 87 also recalls the obligation deriving from the 4th article of that convention, which is to remain vigilant, to take measures against organizations disseminating these ideas. And paragraph 94, which we'll refer to a number of times in this statement, states that the stigmatization of persons through acts or omissions of public authorities, institutions, the media, political parties, or national or local organizations is not only an act of racial discrimination, but it can also incite the recurrence of such acts. And here again, I want to emphasize what the Declaration gave us. Political stigmatization isn't protected opinion, it's an act of racial discrimination. And the problem comes back here. This isn't a normative loophole, this is institutional capture, reverse institutional capture. The political parties are instrumentalizing hate speech in many countries. And I'll share an example from Mexico, for example, because I'm very familiar with it. It's an example of capture, not ultra-right movements in a vacuum. The fact is that if you look at the reforms of 2024, they promoted the popular vote being brought into the judiciary, and as a result, there will be an election of up to 1,600 judges by popular vote over 2025 and 2026. And we now have a situation where we have judges who are applying the Constitution, and there are three reactions by the state in the face of this fight for institutional capture. The first is that in the court, in the High Court, they are actually called traitors of the country. And so when there is a legal disagreement, this is not a political disagreement, we're talking about three judges who are members of the judiciary. As soon as you get that, you get a cascade response from the social networks, coordinated with more than 111,000 posts going out on X over 24 days from one automatic account, which is connected to a single ruling party. And after that, you also have a judge suspended for 90 days without pay for having ruled that there should be an interim stay against a constitutional reform. These three examples, just one single event, convert the judiciary into a politicized instrument which is committing an act of national disloyalty. And that is how it's framed. And of course, we have institutional capture in the same way. There's the case of the institution combating racial discrimination in Argentina, for example, that was dealt with in the same way. And you have political capture in El Salvador as well. And there's many other examples that we're very familiar with in the same space. Now, in terms of international human rights practice, we believe that this architecture, on the basis of paragraph 94 of the Durban Declaration, this represents institutional stigmatization. So if you look at these judges, in their majority women, judges are targeted with sexist narrative. This isn't freedom of opinion. This is an act of structural discrimination on the part of captured entities, captured by political parties. And I think this is where the group of experts can help to clarify. Paragraph 86 and Article 4 of the Convention also must be applied to the digital infrastructure which amplifies hate speech, the data centers which are connected to political parties and to voting centers. They're called different things in different parts of the world, but these echo chambers that amplify voices, the algorithms, the recommended algorithms, which is essential, and we'll discuss this later, are also an important part of this. They require a responsible curation, because otherwise they become echo chambers for hate speech. And I want to share an example. I think you'll know it. The social networks and the algorithms promote difference because difference generates engagement. As you know, if somebody contests a statement, if it generates a negative emotion, the algorithm hones in on that and it amplifies the behavior because it likes the emotion. It's designed to like the emotion. So if you take a position against the position being taken, the algorithm increases the possibility of that being seen again. So if you interact with an ultra-right behavior, which is completely opposed to what you think, you begin to increasingly polarize the environment. And that algorithm is the way we are creating our political communities. So it's extreme on the extreme side, extreme right, but there's an extreme opposed reaction. And so if you look at the various attacks that are happening around the world and the populist attacks, the polarized attacks, they have an equal and opposite reaction. And this is what the algorithms are beginning to generate. And it leads to a huge backlash. I want to share three maneuvers that are used, grammatical maneuvers online. So the first is amalgamation, and this is to fuse heterogeneous groups into a single threat. Now, you know some of these examples. So all migrants are criminals, for example. All people of African descent are connected to drugs trafficking. People who are Muslim are terrorists. People from the LGBTIQ plus community are predators, and so forth. This approach to amalgamation of heterogeneous groups into homogeneous negative groups has consequences when it crosses the line into political parties in the political space. So if you look at paragraph 89 of the Declaration, it sounds the alarm concerning measures that can be used to disseminate racist and xenophobic messaging to the public, which in some cases have led to violence. And in paragraph 16, it also calls it out, where it says xenophobia against non-nationals, migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers is one of the key sources of contemporary racism. So once again, the Declaration doesn't need to be rewritten here, it needs to be applied. The second idea is that victim inversion is used. So what this is casting the hegemonic majority as a victim of the minoritized group. So white people as victims of migrants, Christians as victims of lay people, men as victims of feminist movements. And this rhetorical sleight of hand allows a legitimization of institutional defense as self-defense. The third thing is existential urgency. So building the problem under categories of invasion, replacement, civilizational collapse. And this deactivates democratic deliberation and justifies suspended rights. And here the emotional apparatus is key here. And this leads us to securitization, which is one of the themes of this morning's debate. And I'll go into more depth in a second. One of the most common examples, at least in Latin America at the moment, is the Bukele case, where the urgency of the security issue has allowed a state of emergency, and this then leads to dozens of people being arbitrarily detained on the basis of racial discrimination or the fact they have tattoos or certain physical characteristics. And this argument supports securitization at state level. And I want to focus on a specific characteristic of Latin America here, which is that generally when these enemies are constructed, they are people from the actual country that have been racialized. So Black people, for example, living in shanty towns, in favelas, young people in Quito, Choco in Colombia, interregional migrants, Senegalese people, for example, who have come and to sell in the streets of Buenos Aires, Haitian people in the Dominican Republic, or in Haiti on the border, for example. And you could go on with other examples, but the sleight of hand, the maneuver is the same thing. So producing somebody who is symbolically not a national, so people that are citizens, in fact, legally, are pursuant to that sleight of hand, turned into people that are foreign, criminalized, and that has popular support that is brought in behind it. And so our organizations, what we try and do when we're collecting data in the last cycle for 2026 of the OHCHR, the figures we've collected are very hard-hitting. There's the Brazilian case where people of African descent represented 82.7% of people that died in police operations, for example. In Bahia, it's still worse than the national average. 94.6% of people who die in police operations are of African descent. In the United States, and you'll appreciate that, you're 3 times more likely to die in the hands of the police if you're from the community of African descent. And you've also got, you're far more likely to be imprisoned. And in Toronto, you have a situation where people of African descent are 8.8% of the population, but they represent 70% of those who die in police shooting deaths. And these aren't exceptions. These are the general rule, and they underlie, of course, the motivation of the Durban Declaration. This was already made an offence through the Durban Declaration. And in paragraph 81, it states, impunity pursuant to crimes of xenophobia contributes to instability and undermines our democratic rule. I want to go into more detail about securitization now. When discourse becomes a legal and institutional architecture, this is what you're dealing with. When these discourses are taken on by political establishment, it then becomes a legal and institutional architecture. And if you look at paragraph 25 of the Durban Declaration, this tackles this. It ceases to be an abstract concern and becomes the normative framework that we must apply. What we propose is that we call this phenomenon false security, so capturing the language of human security by authoritarian agents. And we went into more depth in a study that we shared in 2025, and this demonstrated that false security operates through 4 different avenues, 4 different tools, the ones you can see on the screen here. The first is selective regulatory suspension. So states propose vague anti-terrorist laws targeting foreigners, which throttle critical organizations and oppose them. And it's important to call these out when they're identified as soon as possible. The state of emergency in El Salvador, for example, in 2022 has been extended almost on an interrupted basis, and over the 4 years they've consolidated what our report to CEDAW in January this year highlighted was a political and legal architecture whose function is to install the state of emergency as the rule, not an exception. The second thing is the militarization of internal order. And this we can see in El Salvador, the territorial control plan. So they have brought in 40,000 militarized soldiers who have been deployed against the citizenry. And there have been different instances which have been subject to UN investigation, and this hasn't been properly responded to. That's an example from Brazil and the United States. We've identified the use of the National Guard against demonstrators. In Mexico, we've seen a huge number of civilian operatives, CSOs, that have been fallen into the hands of the police and disappeared as a result. Now, the third thing is lawfare. So this is the use of the judiciary to actually go for lawyers and oppress them. So we've seen different examples in Central America. There's the La Parra and Francisco Sandoval cases. They had to go into exile between 2018 and 2023. At least 43 justice operatives, journalists, and others went into exile in Central America, and human rights defense is on the back foot in many of our countries. It's seen as a high-risk activity. The fourth characteristic is targeted institutional violence. So in the El Salvador state of emergency, we've seen 327 cases of enforced disappearance, and approximately 100,000 children have fallen into de facto orphanhood as a result. And families, in the majority headed by women, are paying out an enormous amount of money in order to support people that have been exposed and left vulnerable as a result. You have mass detentions, enforced disappearances, systematic sexual torture, compulsory public nudity, which is used increasingly systematically. Our organizations have also documented it and given it and submitted it to CEDAW, and we're presenting it to this group today as unequivocal evidence that false security violates paragraph 105 of the Durban Declaration. I think one of the most painful things here is that false security doesn't stop with the violation of laws. It perpetuates racist actions within the state. In El Salvador, the budget for women's development was slashed by more than $4 million, and only $2 million remain to actually create environments that propagate protection. Now, if you read these figures together, you can see the most frank way of illustrating how an extreme right position can become a political and administrative institutionalized system in very little time. We're talking about just 4 years for institutional transformation here in some cases. I'll move on so I can close. Signing Durban isn't sufficient. That isn't tantamount to democratic resistance. I was talking about the anti-authoritarian kit earlier. Here, the declaration and the program of action are a necessary precondition to be able to imagine the responses we need. But what we need is an operative theory of democratic resistance, which can be used in institutions or working groups in a practical way. How can you ensure that pluralism and democratic values become a political infrastructure? You have instruments that allow us to clearly identify coalitions, rules, relations that are constructed with people on the ground in territories, working with organizations such as our own. But what we have to establish is how they can defend what is enshrined in the declaration. These are not political positions, they're institutional positions. And we say this with a great deal of caution and with two key caveats. The first of these is that some of these projects clearly have a predominantly Anglophone bias. And in Latin America, obviously, we need to create our own tools, our own languages, our own memories. And that includes the recent memory of the 20th century dictatorships with our own reference points as well and statistics. And the second thing is that civil society must have its own anti-racist manuals that it produces for political parties to use and within political parties, and it must identify how to provide early reporting of cases which violate this. I'll move on to the specific recommendations. I have 6 of them. The first is that in order to adopt maybe an interpretive note of the group on paragraph 94, which would maybe be a good idea. So this is the paragraph on stigmatization by political parties as an act of racial discrimination. This would allow us to distinguish legitimate, critical, democratic policies from institutionalized racism. This would use the Rabat threshold test and also CERD general recommendation number 35. I think this note could be a principal interpretive tool to allow us to move forwards and explore this, and also having a joint thematic statement with the Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, as well as the Special Rapporteur on the freedom of expression. And this could clearly affirm that paragraph 86 of the declaration is applicable also to the digital infrastructure, so the one that amplifies voices, and that it doesn't just come down to the responsibility of users. Now, in terms of implementation mechanisms, I would propose that the Human Rights Council set up a raft of indicators for the implementation of the declaration, with a focus on the advance of the extreme right, with 3 minimum pillars. First of all, the ratio between the budget assigned to Durban and the budget assigned to military and security within a particular polity. Also, the representation of people from racial minorities in parliaments, the judiciary, the armed forces and the media, and also the state of play with legislation and persecution of political parties, as per Article 85. We think that this could be dealt with in the same session that will be dealt with tomorrow as well on digital intelligence, and that we must place digital intelligence at the service of the indicators, not bring it to bear against rights. The fourth idea is to establish an early warning mechanism by the group on legislative regressions. So this will work on states of emergency, laws concerning so-called foreign agents, judicial reforms, anti-migration laws, and cuts to anti-racist institutions. And this will be rooted in the practice of special human rights instruments communications. And we believe that we can carry out rapid mapping, given the limitation, obviously, of resources that each of the working groups are facing. This can be done digitally. Finally, operational support and recognition. We need to formally recognize good practices in terms of the declaration and the protocols used in Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia. You have disaggregated data, which is essential. So this actually reduced, if you used, for example, body cams to collect the data, this reduced fatal operations by 71.8%. vis-a-vis people of African descent, and you've got people who have been liberated in Argentina as a result. So this is excellent practice, and I think this can be very useful for this agenda. And the sixth thing is to call on states to roll out an integral generational reparation plan for victim communities. So we have examples from El Salvador, we have examples from Carrasco communities, we have migrant families that have been borne the brunt of massive violations. And I think in these times of the institutionalized extreme right, this is essential. There are various components here. You have individual judicial review, you have compensation for children who have been orphaned, which is de facto. You have a national disaggregated register and guarantees of non-repetition, which are binding. And I want to close with this thought for the working group. In September 2001, when the declaration was signed, there was a paradigm shift, but that obviously was subject to a massive change when 9/11 occurred. And 25 years later, we have the illusion that we have to choose between security and rights. And the Durban Declaration was drafted precisely to respond to that. It states that you cannot build human security on the back of a stigmatized community, and you cannot have legitimate democracy when you are scapegoating or using a scapegoat to replace the citizen. And I want to close with this. This group in this precise moment is one of the few institutional spaces in the universal system with the sufficient legitimacy and, above all, technical expertise and independence to achieve this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fernandez, also for a highly informative and specialized presentation on this issue. And I note, Madam Chair, the connections between the discussions we are having this morning around far-right extremism and the growth of racism and xenophobia across the globe, and increasingly its impact in the context of the digital spaces, and as well as its impact on young people, which is another thematic discussion that will be held in the course of our session. So we thank the speakers for bringing to light the implications and challenges for democracy, equality, and dignity that is posed by this, the rise of these right-wing movements, for highlighting how technically and politically sophisticated they appear to be becoming in terms of the tools that they're using and the strategies that they're deploying to advance these illiberal ideologies or these divisive or hateful practices, and also for offering some ideas on what we might do or think about in line with the DDPA to respond to the challenges that are posed by these troubling new developments. And Madam Chair, I now open the floor for comments and questions. I will ask, before doing so, that the distinguished experts on the table offer their first reflections, comments, and questions, whereafter I will now move on to the floor. Any questions from the experts? I'll start with you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you so much to our speakers. They have given us a lot of food for thought and exactly what is happening on this licensing issue. I just actually want to go back to some of the key areas that were mentioned, especially by Christine, but also the second speaker, and really like touching into one of the areas that is quite worrying, especially on how migration is being used, to be able to raise hate and also fuel racism, instead of looking at it in perspective of, like people who are coming to, for economic purposes, but also for humanitarian issues, that this issue is worrying when it's put under migration. Also the whole area of hate crime and discrimination in itself. We've seen, for example, people demonstrating or far-right demonstrating outside accommodations on where people who are seeking international protection are living, or even, attacking them physically or verbally. This has needed to stop, and this is a worrying trend that is happening. Also, the disinformation and fear based on, the mobilization that is going on as well, and spreading of this misleading information, especially on migrant men in particular. You've mentioned the last speaker on the target on people of African descent, and we have seen, for example, black men being labeled as less rapist, and actually this also fueling fear and reinforcing stereotypes, and this kind of misinformation is quite worrying. The trends are quite worrying. So I'm very happy that these discussions are going on. And also, I just wanted to highlight the area where you mentioned about the opinions, and the freedom of speech and all that, because we hear quite often people saying that they have rights to speak, they have rights to say whatever they want to say. But the DPP also, as you mentioned, and you stated the section there, we have to look into this and see how people can be protected more. So I'm very happy with the information that has been given by both our speakers. I would actually like to hear more from both of them on the side of, balancing that and looking into the whole area of when people feel like they're entitled between the freedom of speech or freedom of opinion, and when there's hate that fuels stereotypes, hate that actually lead to reinforcing more exclusion, and people not even being offered jobs or opportunities because of the hate that has been spread online and in everywhere. So I would like to hear a little bit more on how we can work on that. And then very finally, on the whole area of media, and in particular on how people can be protected by being targeted through media, and now being made even worse because of the AI. Christine also mentioned about the youth in her presentation. In our discussions yesterday, we were trying to figure out how we can engage youth more, so that they can be maybe champions of human rights and also understand issues of intersectionality and how racism manifests itself in a better way. So how do we actually bring the youth, rather than even thinking of how do we put more rules and laws and regulations into combating social media as it pertains to youth? How do we target them more in education and encouraging them to look at the issues of racism and discrimination from an education perspective? I'll stop it there. Thank you, our Chair Joel.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I hope the speakers have noted the questions. Let me take another set of questions from the expert, Ambassador Khan, and then we'll hand over back to the speakers.
Thank you very much. I am also really grateful to the panelists, Christina and Fernandez, for a very informed presentations by them. The rise of right-wing movement, it is an important, but it also a very sensitive subject, because as you explore these subjects, you come across fault lines at global level, at regional level, at societal levels, which are actually very complex and difficult to deal with. I would like to raise a few points in the light of, since I'm heading a think tank, and in that think tank we are undertaking research currently on a project which is dealing with how to strengthen or how to increase diversity in our society and in our region, and how to counter political extremism. And since this think tank is located at a university, so we come across large number of youth at that university, and that also provides us an opportunity to get their views. So in the light of this interaction, I would like to share some points on this subject. One is that we are constantly seeing two increasing trends. One is that the number of far right parties, far right movements are across the world is increasing. It may be different in different parts of the world, the increase may be different in different parts of the world, but generally it is very difficult to attach a number. But I mean, it can be safely argued that 30% is a 30% increase in the number of far right movements in the last few years. And then secondly, it is very disturbing to note that these movements and groups are gaining ground in societies, in the, in the politics, in the political systems in the countries. Now, there is the securitization as a result of this rise of far right or political extremism is leading to, we are witnessing it in terms of violence and coercion in the societies. We are in observing it through immigration, and it is not just immigration, but global connectivity is being affected as a result of the immigration, restrictions on immigration, or restrictions on movement. And we are seeing perhaps the world is the division between the two worlds, global north and global south, is consolidating, and it is becoming very difficult for free for ensuring free movement between the two worlds, which was a kind of objective and goal maybe a few decades ago, and we were making progress towards that. Then political, social, economic, cultural rights are being affected. And then we are also seeing sometimes banning of political parties, political thoughts, or leaders or social activists arguing a certain kind of thought or certain kind of of action. So all these things are happening in the societies. Now, while all these things are happening in the societies, we also come across an intellectual paradox. And when we talk to these youth, they generally say that it is not a debate on democracy versus far right. They say that the far right is also using the democratic principle or established democratic structures of one person, one vote. And if through one person, one vote, a far right party or a right wing party comes into power, then and obtains majority, it has the right to promote its manifesto and its own political agenda. I'm not arguing their point of view, but I'm just trying to, place it before the experts here that this is the line of argument we normally get from them. And then at times, countries and states have taken measures to ban parties or ban certain leaders. And that is also proving counterproductive, because banning political parties and political leaders, we see that it results into an increase in popularity, an increased populism of such parties. So what I am trying to lead towards is that in our way forward, as our expert panelists have also suggested, in our way forward, we have to be informed, we have to be effective, and we have to devise some long-term approach. Fernandez, I think, suggested that, and very rightly suggested, that there is no need to rewrite DDPA. DDPA is already there. So we have to enforce its implementation. And enforcement is actually a very, again, very tricky issue in the given circumstances being faced by the world, by the institutions. So here I think it is important that relevant mechanism, this mechanism is only one small part of these mechanisms and mandates, but these mechanisms have to play an important role. And secondly, there is, I think, it is important to focus on education and awareness. Education means that education systems should be focusing on curricula, how curriculas are designed, how educative practices are adopted, which elaborate true spirit or true structures of democracy. And in the awareness, it is important to relay a message, as Salome has also suggested, use of media or use of other means, social media and other means, that electoral majority does not mean to crush the minority. There are limits of electoral authority, and these limits should become sacrosanct. So I will stop here, but I will request both the expert panelists to to throw some more light on these issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Was there any questions? Just a short note that Dr. Liang will need to leave us at 12, so if we can focus the questions for her so that she's able to at least provide some closing remarks, and then we will have Fernandez remaining with us and will engage also with the floor.
Thank you. So thank you to the experts. I have you drop very powerful arguments, very powerful ideas on how, for example, the capture of the democracy or capture of the institutions, let's say, can lead to far-right movements to replicate racism and such. But for example, for Mrs. Christina, I would like to ask you if you had approach these companies on how to deal with the dark web, because for example these mainstream social media like X, like Facebook, like Instagram, they already have in place certain policies, but how to get into the dark web where the majority of these far-right movements are spreading their hateful messages. And for Luis Fernandez, I would like to talk a little bit about the elephant in the room, which is because I loved what you said about making anti-racism, because it's already there in the DDPA, part of the democratic values that we must insist on. But for example, most of these far-right groups, they hide behind the idea of freedom of speech, right? Because freedom of speech and the limits with hate speech are very blurred, and it depends on the context. For example, in the US, freedom of speech is so protected that you can say a lot of things about certain populations up until you made a clear request to attack. It's all valid, right? So how can we deal with freedom of speech? Because the far right, they took it as a democratic value as well. So how can we can deal with that? And thank you both.
Thank you very much. Dr. Liang, can I hand over to you, and also thank you for your contribution. I know you need to sort of sneak your way out once you've responded, but these are some of the questions that you've received, and I know that we have your slides and you are here in Geneva, so we will continue to engage you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I apologize. We actually have a Geneva security debate at our center in half an hour, so I have to run. But I really, I also wanted to thank Luis Fernandez for your excellent presentation. I've learned a lot. I wanted to address first the questions from the chair. Chair, I think you put your finger on the issue that is really incredibly important, is the media. I think the media is no longer neutral. It no longer shows a complete picture. all the media, we see that, and even some of my favorite media voices have now really monetized the media in a sense that they're really highlighting the more kind of the dark, the more dangerous stories. They're not, well, I never see anything positive on the news anymore. And I really think this is driving this polycrisis also of young people feeling that there is really no longer much hope left, in the sense that there's conflict and war, there's climate change, there's the rise of extremism, and the worry of terrorist attacks. So I think one of the things we really need to work on is the media. But again, another thing we need to work on is this whole idea of whole of society approach. It's not just about teaching young people about the worries of what they can find online in the social media space, but it's also teaching people of my generation, people who are teachers, who are community leaders, who are politicians, people who actually make policies. They should be the ones who are also become increasingly aware of the harms that are now available online and also in the dark web. And that leads me to the next question, the deep web, the dark web. I'm afraid we have no access to that part of the web, and as we have seen now, crime has also grown incredibly because of this. So what we need to do really is work with the Global Internet Forum on Counterterrorism, which is an organization of all the major tech companies, and it was created actually by the Big Five in order to stop extremism and terrorism online. But yes, indeed, there are some companies that allow extremist terrorist behavior to go unregulated, and there is really nothing we can do about this at this moment. However, we can warn young people from these spaces, keep them away, and at least stop these spaces from getting monetized by having many people use them. Again, this is something that is very, very difficult to do. Another thing I just wanted to highlight really importantly is also influencers. I see more and more the importance of influencers, YouTubers, online, who have a big impact. Music has an impact on young people. How can we not harness these groups to also have a positive impact on young people? Find influencers that influence wonderful things as opposed to negative and terrorist ideas. Music is a way to express yourself when you're young. Why can't we maybe get the music industry on board? I still remember Bob Geldof and Band Aid. I'm that old. Why can't we have maybe a music festival that promotes anti-hatred and this type of movement? So I think it needs to become a movement, a global movement of against discrimination, against racism, against stereotypes, against conspiracy theories. And it needs to start not only from the young people, but from all generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fernandez, over to you.
Muchísimas
Thank you very much.
also a lot from you, and we know you have to go. A ver, contesto.
Let's see. I want to answer perhaps with a few ideas. First of all, concerning the implementation of this discussion on this border between freedom of expression and censorship, which is quite right. In the United States, we hear that argument used the most, but this discussion has been presented for some time in these terms. And in the presentation, I mentioned the Rabat threshold. It's a very specific test that can be used in very institutionalized spaces. And I would suggest that it's used in this working group and in spaces that require technical objectivity to be able to identify nuance and the difference between these two things. This is essential, I think. It's an instrument that does warrant a lot of attention, this border between freedom of expression and then hate speech, which constitutes an attack and discrimination and fostering violence. So the test has 6 parts. I just want to share this, and we can use available tools to do this. And we can analyze speeches, not just one, you can analyze a whole raft of speeches. You can use it to assess all speeches made by presidents, I don't know, over the last 12 months. And you can apply the standard to that. The standard has context, which is the social and historical and political environment in which the speech is being given. So is there pre-existing tension? Is this a post-conflict setting? If you look at South Africa post-apartheid, for example, is that where the speech is being given? Are we talking about a speech where there's a presidential campaign which is revolving around a minority group? Does that context exist? If that exists, you can rank it. You can put it on a literal simple scale, a 5-point scale, which allows you to assess each of these standards. And it can be more complex depending on how much data you have and how many questions you want to use to assess that context. There's different ways of doing it. The second is the status of the person. It was said by Luis Fernandez, who's a member of the civil society, or was it said by the President of the Republic, or a member of the expert group of the United Nations against racial discrimination? That matters, and that generates different legitimacy. And so the profile of the person matters a lot, and then you can have a number of different questions which follow up on that. The third variable of the test is the intention underlying it. Can you clearly identify the intention of the speaker? Is that intention to generate hate speech and generate stigmatization around a particular group? I won't share different examples, but it happens in presidential campaigns where you hear people saying migrants are, and then you have a label. In the Dominican Republic, for example, it happens a lot. Haitians are X, Y, Z, and it leads to brutal stigmatization against that community. The fourth thing is the content and the form. Is it done in order to provoke? Is it done as a joke? How is it said? How can you assess the content and the form? Obviously, in politics, it's said that the form matters as much as the substance, and that's how you identify the nuance. Then you have extensions to the scope. Is it referring to a particular group whose behaviors can be identified within your population and territory? And the last thing is the probability of harm. And so is it a call to action? This includes the imminent nature of it. Are you calling to certain groups? Are you calling for participation in decision-making spaces? And this allows you to resolve at least the tension that you might otherwise have. And I'll close on that. At least this would be one of my suggestions, that this group, on the basis of the legitimacy it has, and it must maintain, could use and offer that standard and develop a lot of questions to say, look, everybody use this standard. And with that guide, I think a lot of governments around the world and many political and social actors would be very grateful for something like that to be offered. It's been adopted. It's been adopted by the Human Rights Committee. It's been used by the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and other spaces, which obviously are very familiar to people here. Another idea I want to share on the basis the questions. I don't know in detail how the dark web operates, but I do understand a little bit how it can be accessed. But the issue isn't access to the dark web in of itself, but the interaction that takes place within it. The challenge of the dark web, or at least the principal aim, is that you don't identify the user. So when we're dealing with hate speech in those spaces, it's very hard to identify perpetrators, above all because they generate connection mirrors. And let me explain this. Imagine that you connect yourselves to a particular IPA address, and that's headquartered in some address, Mexico, Bangladesh, France, Switzerland. Once you connect to that, that generates a replica as if you were there, and you had 100 origin connections that are generated in 100 different spaces, and that generates a new mirror that multiplies it again in 100 other locations, each of them. So it's almost impossible to identify the genuine origin. So if you're dealing with speech, it's very hard to see where it comes from, different discourses. And so the challenge for authorities is to identify or promote or combat these interactions and generate exchanges outside of this space. And we've had the issue of trafficking in weapons, trafficking in children, and other issues that are often discussed in that space being brought out of it. And I think for hate speech and maybe securitization or far-right movements, I think the debate is happening in other spaces. I'm not certain this is the key location of the debate. Incel groups, for example, in fact, they're playing outside of that space, to be honest. Now, on regulation, something we have to regulate within these speeches is that, or hate speech, is that we all already know that the algorithms in the social networks operate to promote polarization. They capitalize on polarization and aggressive exchanges. And I think it's worth national regulation allowing at least a principle to be established where we see that that is the aim, and you can see that posted, you can have that notified. And I think it's very hard to regulate these social networks because they operate in a supranational space. We've had a lot of discussions in these spaces along these lines to regulate them. Countries can generate oversight pop-up windows, so that when somebody uses one of the social networks, they know what they're getting into. And I think also think about which populations we can target those messages to. Always when it's a child, if you open the application and you want to interact on an issue, you have a notification. And we have been able to see that on certain networks, and you've seen certain warning messages. In X, for example, you can see the ticket, the label that says, this false news is connected to this publication by some individual some time ago, and it's not substantiated. If we manage to achieve that in the design of the algorithm to avoid confrontation and hate speech, I think it could be extremely advantageous. And the last thing, which is more a question of a structural or global question under the mandate of the UN or the treaty bodies or the special procedures or this working group as well, is the question of the capacity and scope to communicate the work, the standards, the guidelines, the resolutions. And I think there is an issue here where we need to invest more time into communication. You need to, from these spaces, invest in guides and guidelines, and also exploit artificial intelligence, which can conflate large quantities of information in very little time, and that can create inputs and guides and information campaigns. And it can do that in minutes, conflating days and days of work. And I think you can focus that on governments and political actors and institutions and parties that you want to target for your messaging. That would be a key recommendation, I think. And that includes if there are different support profiles that maybe can be capitalized on by the working group, that would be one of the most significant contributions. And obviously, the work is often limited to these spaces that we're in now. And we really need social actors to know that there are ways of fighting back and preventing the advance of hate speech that so damage human dignity at their root.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fernandez, for the comprehensive responses. I now open the floor for comments and questions to member states or representatives of civil society and academia for any comments and questions. Representatives of civil society and academia, please remember when you take the floor to please state which organization you are representing. I see the delegation of Mexico. You have the floor, sir.
Gracias, presidente. Muy buenas.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and very good afternoon to all of our eminent experts and the panelists. It's a great pleasure to be here. The panel dealt with different themes which I think are of extreme relevance for our country. And specifically, I think each of the presentations highlighted an important issue. So I wanted to share a few words directed to each of the panelists and their presentations. But before that, I just wanted to, as a global comment, say that some of these discussions, above all those concerning hate speech and criminalization, are being discussed as well in the context of the intergovernmental, or rather the special committee of the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And a week ago, there was the beginning of a negotiation on the additional protocol on the Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination with the explicit aim of criminalizing hate speech. And I think one of the discussions, maybe, or some of the discussions that have been held here today could feed into that process, and we could generate synergies between the different mechanisms that we have at our disposal, which are tackling all of these issues. So one recommendation or suggestion would be to try and explore that synergy. Now, turning to the specific presentations that were made, to Dr. Maduri, I want to say that the whole issue of stigmatization of migrants resonates a lot. Mexico believes that we need to generate narratives concerning the positive contributions made by migrants to societies, the societies in which they are located. And states also need to generate more social inclusion policies. The migrants that have decided to settle and live their lives in a particular country away from their country of origin. So I'm very grateful for that presentation. Mexico is presenting, every other year presents a resolution to the HRC on this issue. And in the last resolution, we focused it on narratives, positive narratives on migration. Now, on the issue of terrorism, unfortunately, Dr. Lang already left, but I wanted to share that on that subject, Mexico is equally a promoter and author of the resolution that was established by the Special Rapporteur 20 years ago, the Special Rapporteur on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms in the context of the combat against terror. That resolution is still presented every 3 years to the Human Rights Council. And the aim of the role of the Special Rapporteur is in part that we've been discussing, the role of providing guidance, standards, normative contributions to states that can then use those so we can help them when they're designing their policies to combat terror to respect human rights. And when we say respect human rights, we're also thinking about avoiding stigmatizing certain groups on the basis of racial criteria or religious criteria or on the basis of their migratory status. And that terror laws are not used as a legitimization for stigmatizing those groups. So that's very important for us. And Mexico presented a resolution along with Egypt on terrorism and human rights, which is, well, broader than the resolution on the mandate of the Special Rapporteur, but still obviously tackles this important issue. And finally, Mr. Fernandez, thank you very much for your presentation. We really appreciate the connection you made with the different paragraphs from the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action. I think that's quite innovative. I've been looking for some years at the processes and working groups that use that kind of approach, and oftentimes they don't make an explicit direct connection with the instruments or the conventions, or in this case, the Durban Declaration, which is obviously the source of everything we're talking about. So that's an excellent, I think, exercise that I very much welcome. And I just wanted to mention the concrete example you used about Mexico, judicial reform. Now, we think this example isn't perhaps the most appropriate in the context of a panel that's dedicated to tackling the far right, given that the current political position of Mexico is far from that. It's totally humanist, and the Mexican state has promoted various social policies to confront racism and discrimination. So I just wanted to flag that. And I'm very grateful to everybody for the presentations.
Thank you very much to the delegate from Mexico. The floor remains open for comments and questions. Over to you. Please introduce yourself.
And esteemed experts. I'm Sarah Al-Kashlock. I am a legal researcher and practitioner in international law at the Geneva Graduate Institute. I first want to say how informative the session was, and the guidance provided is not merely just helpful as researchers, but for states. I note the concerns of hate speech and the use of media and promoting xenophobic ideas and racial discrimination towards vulnerable communities, especially in the rise of extremist right-wing groups. I was wondering whether what the expert group's opinion was on existing racialized securitization policies and laws implemented by states, where national security is the foreground of extended states of emergency, where we see counterterrorism laws, migration policies, laws and policies regarding environment and health, how they are used and manufactured in ways to target existing vulnerable communities within the state and migrants and vulnerable communities entering the state, especially the intersectional impact that these policies have. Again, many thanks for this very informative session, and I look forward to your responses.
Thank you very much. The floor remains open for comments and questions before we begin to close our session. Thank you very much. I shall take it that there are no further questions and comments. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Chair, thank you for allowing me to speak now. My name is Wanji Kumbogwa, and I'm from a charity called Bauzo that is based in Wales in the UK. We support victims of domestic abuse and other forms of exploitation from different communities across the world. I just wanted to bring to the attention of this sitting today about issues that are taking place in the UK, and indeed in my hometown of Wrexham, which is a small town in Wales. And I'm talking from a perspective of a community that is actually in transition, seeing that we now have asylum seekers and refugees living in Wrexham, and we've had a lot of migrant workers who've come to Wrexham in the last few years. And within that time, we've seen a situation in Wrexham that is not isolated to the rest of the UK, where we have far-right activity, a lot of it from parties who are opposed to migrants settling in the area. And within this, we've seen structural racism that has made the new arrivals so vulnerable. In the UK, actually right now, many migrant workers find themselves trapped in a vicious cycle of precarity where the vulnerability has been brought about by the policies in place, like the no recourse to public funds law in the UK, and visas that tie workers to a single employer. And so this creates a power imbalance that mirrors modern slavery, as a lot of them cannot move from one worker to employer to another. And again, we've seen that when migrant workers in our care and agricultural sectors are denied the ability to report their abuse for fear of deportation, the state is not merely failing to protect them, it's actively engineering their marginalization. And we're seeing a lot of this happen over and over again. Then there's the other issue in the UK about the political race to the bottom. We are witnessing, and especially now we have elections in Wales tomorrow, and what we have witnessed is a dangerous convergence where mainstream political actors, for fear of losing ground to populist movements like Reform Party, have begun to sanitize and adopt the rhetoric of the far right. We've had now major parties like the ruling Labour Party using dehumanizing language such as the innovation or illegal or people coming on the boats on migrants. And this have really had a big impact on how the common person thinks about the migrants in the UK, and especially in my village of Wrexham where I live. So for me, I am urging this, the group of experts to call upon the United Kingdom to dismantle that hostile environment and recognize that structural racism in labor laws is a primary driver of human rights violations, to challenge the mainstreaming of xenophobic rhetoric that is being used, and it's being used to appease populist voters, and also to protect community cohesion, because the support for local initiatives is now being watered down by that, is it bottom up, bottom, where even people that want to do good are scared of doing the right thing by the migrants because of what's being said from the top, from the political parties that are ruling the country. So that's some of what I wanted to bring to this setting today, just to bring to attention as an experience, what you call first-person experience of what's happening on the ground when it comes to far-right experience on people that are living in the UK and who are migrants, having come from different parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mugua, for that perspective. I trust that the group of experts has noted your account and experience of these challenges. The floor remains open. Thank you. Taking it that there are no further comments or questions from the floor, I would now like to hand over to our distinguished panelist, Mr. Fernandez, for his brief closing remarks. Thank you.
Muchísimas
Thank you very much. Well, I hope I can tackle some of the statements, although some questions were directed to the group of experts and not necessarily to me as a panelist. But maybe I'll close with a couple of ideas specifically on the Mexican case. I think I'll begin there, and I'm very grateful to the delegate and the representation in this space. I think it's important to have these exchanges. There are examples of institutional capture or capture within some political parties which clearly place greater emphasis on the promotion of xenophobia, racism, or the advance of far-right agendas. And there was also the example of Argentina that I shared. It's difficult and it's complex sometimes to think about eliminating an institution that's responsible for combating racial discrimination, xenophobia, and racism. And it's a concrete example. When you get movements of that nature, they can rapidly dismantle structures which promote and defend democratic values, or values that we believe to be democratic. And one of those values is the balance of powers as well. And that brings me to the Mexican example, I think, in particular, judicial independence, because often we talk about conduct that allows us to advance certain agendas. Now, it might not be a far-right agenda that is oppressing minorities, but there are examples of institutional capture which sometimes can undermine the proper division of powers. And I think it's important that we recognize these conducts that lead towards capture of institutions wherever it is in the world, because that generates democratic risk. It slowly waters down pluralism. Despite a government being under a humanist or a non-humanist banner, and independently of the political ideology that you arrive with, I think we all need to be aware that we're capable as individuals and organizations and groups of experts of identifying conduct that could jeopardize or undermine the protection of minorities, in this case, judicial independence as one of the pillars of democracy. So I give it as an example, and it's not an example closely or explicitly connected to racism or xenophobia, and I'm very grateful that Mexico is one of the countries where we have protection for many of those groups and where things are not getting worse. On the other questions, I'd maybe leave that to the expert group to answer. So just to close, I want to thank you very much for this initiative, and you can count on us, and I hope we can work together to go into more depth concerning some of the proposals that we made in this space, and I look forward to the conversation and the conclusions that will arise from this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fernandez. The thanks is ours for your expertise and work in advancing human rights. As we approach closure, I will now invite any of the expert members to offer brief responses to any of the broad questions. We note, of course, that these are ongoing conversations. They are connected to the other sessions that we will be having and will be reflected appropriately in our recommendations. However, if there are any pressing interventions from the group of experts, I now open the floor once again to you, Ambassador Khan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Thank you so much. I would also once again thank the panelist, Dr. Fernandez. Cristiano has already left. There was one question regarding the national security dimensions, and we are actually witnessing that there is a rising trend of using national security in the governance of states, in the governance of citizens, and it leads to restriction or violation of human rights in general, and at times it leads to discriminatory practices against certain groups of citizens. So that is an increasing trend which we are also witnessing because of the rising conflicts at global and regional level, increasing number of wars, insurgencies, militancies, and such, and acts of terrorism that are proliferating in various parts of the world. Now, states have to exercise balance in utilizing national security as a pretext. There are times when there are genuine national security concerns, and the citizens also respect the rights of the states or authority of the states at such occasions. But there are times when these national security can be used as a pretext for achieving certain ends, and that line is actually, the line between the two is quite blurred. So I think it is an important role for the human rights community at national level, as well as the human rights institutions at regional and global levels, to keep a check on these trends and deal with these trends, in a way that the fundamental goal of promotion and protection of human rights is achieved and secured in accordance with the universal conventions on the human rights.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Khan. Jose?
Thank you. Just to comment a little bit on the same topic of securitization, and I don't want to make Mexico the topic of the table, but I have to emphasize on that because the U.S.-Mexico border is the largest borderline in the world. So we have a lot of information about it. And yes, securitization it's a problem. Many of the, let's say, technology that it's applied there, it has a racial profiling problem, right? And those are the same systems that are applied in other borders, like for example in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank. Also, those systems are used, and they are racially profiling people, through facial recognition, through target movements, etc. And for as much as the current Mexican government has an anti-racist vocation, which is true, that doesn't exempt that the consequences over migrant people are less grave or less of a problem, because actually the external pressure from the US government to the Mexican government is a reality, right? And many of the migrants that in the past they wanted to cross through Mexico, but nowadays want to stay in Mexico, have been increasing, and most of them don't get the refugee status because there's like overload of work for the Mexican institutions. And also the National Guard and the Army, now they have these tasks of surveillance of migrant people, or at least the ones they think they're migrant. And of course, they apply this racist profiling just to, quote unquote, identify who is migrant and who's not. And that's where the Mexican racism activates, right? Because most of the times, Black people are not seen as Mexicans, so they're very easily profiled by the police or by the National Guard or by the military. So yes, those are realities, and I know that the government is doing things, but the external pressures are so much that sometimes they don't want to compromise that much, because there are other interests like the trade or political situations that they want to avoid. And so that's a little bit of the reality in that part of the world.
Thank you very much. Before handing over to you, Madam Chair, I would like to thank the two speakers who have provided broad-ranging accounts of the rise of far-right nationalism, its connections to racism, authoritarianism, its threat to democracy, and of course, most importantly, the ways in which technology and young people are key levers for the propagation of these ideas, but also for fertile sites for its combating. The task before us is not only to confront the symptoms of this global drift towards right-wing authoritarianism, but is also to try and understand the deep underlying conditions that have led us to the present situation. This requires clarity about the role of propaganda, misinformation, the continuity between historical and contemporary forms of authoritarianism, and the ways in which racism, xenophobia, religious, cultural intolerance are embedded in the discourses and systems that now govern much of the world. It also requires a commitment to defending the substantive meaning of democracy against the procedural hollowing and manipulation of these ideas of equality, of dignity. In so doing, we affirm that democracy cannot be reduced to merely formal equality, but must also become a lived practice of continuous justice, reparation, inclusion, accountability, and most importantly, shared humanity. These are the deep underlying ideals of the DDPA. And the challenge of our time, Madam Chair, is to defend and deepen this understanding in the face of anti-democratic racist forces that now seek to narrow it. And with those words, Madam Chair, I'd like to hand the chair back to you for the closure of our session. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to everyone who has participated and engaged this particular topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joel, for moderating this session. Thank you also to our contributors, our experts who have given us a lot of food for thought, but also these are discussions that are going to continue with this group, I promise you, and everybody who have raised questions there. And just also to say that, I know the Mexico raised a point there that the intergovernmental group is discussing the issue of hate speech, I think, and that would be something also that we would like to hear more or further on those discussions as well, and how we can engage on them to be able to learn more and know more, or even to input. So that is very much welcome. And also going back to what Wanjiko has raised, I think the whole impact of far right has impacted on many people, not only in UK, but all over the world, of where, they are being experienced. In my work, I know how it have impacted, especially on women who call to say, can they get out of the house to take their children to school? These are people who are living with lived experiences on the impact of far right, for example, and also how it impacts on people accessing services and support, and also access to basic rights, such as even access to employment, due to the enforcement of this kind of stereotype and the misinformation that comes up. So the information today that we have that has been presented to us by our two experts will help a lot in advancing, the understanding of this issue and moving forward into looking into this as a group of experts. And now, as we close, I want to bring to an end our first session or our first meeting. I wish to thank our distinguished presenters, Fernandez and Christina, and all participants for staying up to this time and for contributing as well. We will reconvene again this afternoon at 3 p.m. We will have the thematic discussion titled Commemorating 25 Years of the DDPA, Strengthening Implementation and Closing the Gaps. And I'm requesting all of you to come back. I hereby close the first public meeting of the 12th session of the Group of Independent Eminent Experts on the implementation of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. you.